Welcome to Community Policy Speaks, our podcast here at Community Policy Forum. Community Policy Forum is an independent think tank seeking to promote evidence-based and community-centered approaches to policymaking surrounding the structural inequalities impacting Muslim communities in the UK. We attempt this through connecting policymakers with academic research and experts, and through providing platforms for engagement with diverse Muslim voices on areas of contemporary importance. In recent days, the UK has experienced its most severe rioting since 2011, with around 500 people having been arrested and 150 charged at the time of recording. The violence erupted after a stabbing at a children's event in Southport on 29th July, where a 17-year-old, Axel Rudakubana, was arrested. Despite being British-born, false rumors spread online claiming he was a Muslim immigrant. These rumors were amplified by far-right figures like Tommy Robinson, Nigel Farage, and Andrew Tate, leading to anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant riots across the UK. The riots have involved attacks on mosques, hotels housing asylum seekers, and hate crimes against Muslim bystanders, with cities and towns like Liverpool, Hartlepool, and Rotherham particularly affected. To discuss the riots, the factors behind them, and the far right as a whole, we're joined by two distinguished experts in this area. So firstly, Aaron Winter. Aaron is Senior Lecturer in Sociology and Director of the Centre for Alternatives to Social and Economic Inequalities at Lancaster University. He is co-editor of Researching the Far Right, Theory, Method and Practice, and co-author with Aurelien Mondon of Reactionary Democracy, How Racism and the Populist Far Right Became Mainstream. He is also co-editor of the journal Identities and the Manchester University Press series, Racism, Resistance and Social Change, as well as on the editorial board of Ethnic and Racial Studies and organizing committee of the Reactionary Politics Research Network. Aurelien Mondon is a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Bath and co-convener of the Reactionary Politics Research Network. His research focuses predominantly on the mainstreaming of reactionary politics, focusing in particular on the role of elite discourse. His latest book, as previously mentioned, Reactionary Democracy, How Racism and the Populist Far Right Became Mainstream, was co-written with Aaron and published in 2020 with Verso. In 2024, he co-edited The Ethics of Researching the Far Right with Antonio Vaughan, Joanne Braun, and Megan Tinsley. Thank you so much, both of you, for taking time out of what I'm sure has been a crazy schedule over these past couple of weeks with everything going on to join us today to discuss this topic. So I wanted to come to yourself first, Aurelien. When we say far right, what do we mean?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's what's been positive in the last few days, and not a lot has been positive in the last few days. But what's been positive is that we've seen the term far right being used more willingly by the mainstream media, by mainstream politicians as well, and I think this is good news. And I think talking about definitions can seem very boring, and talking about terminology can seem a bit pedantic at times. But I think it is important that we get these things right, or at least clear. There's no perfect term and there's no perfect definition, but I think we need to kind of name what we're talking about. And so what Aaron and I talk about when we use the term far right is really the kind of politics that have racism and other forms of exclusion at their core, but generally a bit more hidden than what we call extreme right. So we use both of these terms together in a way. So the extreme right would be the kind of more violent, openly racist form of kind of like such politics. That's what we saw on the streets in a way. This kind of really kind of outpouring of violence and open unadulterated racism. And what we call the far right is kind of more this kind of broader movement that tries to become legitimized, if you want, and legitimate by pretending that what we're talking about is not necessarily racism, but it's culture or it's religion, for example, which we see with Islamophobia. And of course, you don't have to scratch the surface very much to see that actually the politics are very much the same. But what we try to argue really with extreme right, far right, and mainstream is that they are not categories that are completely exclusive of each other in many ways, and the borders are very much fuzzy between each of them. And so what you can find, and that's why we focus a lot on discourse as opposed to focusing solely on actors or on political parties, what you can find is that actually ideas travel from one to the other depending on context, depending on strategies, depending on what's happening. And that's why, what we argue is that, far-right politics can be found also within the mainstream. And what we've seen increasingly is a mainstreaming of far-right politics, if not necessarily far-right actors or political parties. And so it's really important that we kind of like think about these things as moving in a way. The mainstream is not necessarily a bulwark against the far right, and it can very much enable the far right by platforming it, as we've seen in recent days.
Thank you, Aurelien. And that segues quite nicely onto my question for Aaron, which is how has the far right, or perhaps we want to call it the extreme right movement in the UK, evolved over the past decade? And what factors do you think have fueled its recent resurgence?
Well, thank you. I think one of the problems with understanding and mapping how the far right has moved and developed and evolved is a slipperiness around definitions and terminology and the way it's both represented and sees itself. So in a sense, it's been what we've seen over the past number of years is an increasing mainstreaming, legitimization, mainstreaming of far right ideas. Sometimes under sort of euphemistic terms such as populism or populist, but what we've seen is a move from a more traditional street level activism to more we've seen rebranding exercises in the early 2000s, but oftentimes the idea of the far right or extreme right is defined and labeled and positioned as a proxy for racism and a threat to our sort of mainstream, multicultural, liberal, democratic settlement, and such that even while the far right tries to mainstream, we also see mainstream politics representing it as a popular demon, but also a popular will, such that far-right ideas are taken on by the mainstream in order to, I guess what they often say is prevent violence from breaking out and preventing the sort of the more electoral and even slightly more mainstream far right from getting more power. I mean, right now what we're seeing is a very emboldened street level far and extreme right on the streets. And we're also seeing an electoral gains for the parliamentary far right in the form of Reform UK. But what's interesting about this is for a long time, you've heard in Britain, unlike other European countries, we've never elected a far right. And that's partly because the far right has been operated as street level activism. And I use the term activism in sort of scare quotes. And the mainstream has taken on its ideas as if they were the will of the people, and as if the far right was so beyond the pale that we can't have them in office, better have their ideas repackaged. And I think we've seen this over the past number of while, and me and Aurelien have been warning about that in our work, about the way in which you have a sort of far right politics, sometimes even without the far right in power, because there are ideas about immigration, about trans rights, about Muslims are the political currency of the day. And I think in terms of mainstreaming those ideas to offset or to prevent it spilling over into street level violence or the far right getting electoral power, we're seeing both right now. And that's a really, really dangerous mix.
That's really interesting. And a lot of the themes that you discussed there are ones that we're going to delve into a little bit more throughout this podcast episode. And Aurelien, coming back to yourself, and Aaron touched on this when he spoke about the mainstreaming of far right or extreme right ideas in parliamentary politics. What role have political figures, in your opinion, played in normalizing or legitimizing far right ideas and actions?
They have played a key role, and this is one of the things that's particularly important, to understand today where we're at, because it's it's very easy to kind of like think of what has happened on the streets of the UK in the last few days as something that's exceptional, but it's a bunch of like bad eggs about like thugs, or as Starmer called them, and that they just like, acting out of nowhere. But what we're trying to argue, as Aaron was saying, is that, there is no mainstreaming of the far right without an active engagement of mainstream actors and mainstream politicians in particular. These people act as enablers of far right politics. And if they were not acting as an enabler of far right politics wouldn't be so popular in inverted commas, and extreme right actors wouldn't be so emboldened as well. So I think it is very, very important that people take responsibility in the mainstream. And so mainstream politicians have mainstream politics, mainstream far right politics in a number of ways. I mean, one of the ones that Aaron mentioned is the euphemization of far-right politics by calling people like Nigel Farage populist, for example. We've seen that in other countries, of course. We've seen Marine Le Pen being called like that. What's fascinating about the term populism, of course, is that it was really first reintroduced in this kind of arena by far-right actors themselves in the early 1990s. Jean-Marie Le Pen, the leader of the Front National then, a very far/extreme right party, was trying to replace the term extreme right with populism, because he knew that populism is nowhere as stigmatizing as extreme right or far right. What's fascinating, of course, is that a lot of mainstream elite, including politicians, are using populism as an insult. But for the far right, it's a lot better to be called populist than to be called extreme right, fascist, racist, and so on, particularly as these terms are not only more stigmatizing, but also more accurate. So euphemization has been very, very important. The other thing that has happened as well is borrowing the discourse of the far right by pretending, and again, this is something that Aaron has talked about, by pretending that this is what the people want. And in particular, this is what the left behind want. This is what the white working class want. This has been debunked, including by our research and that of others. But it has been incredibly powerful as a narrative. And, we have seen many elite far-right and extreme-right actors pretend that they are on the side of the people, again in inverted commas, that they are on the side of the left behind, again in inverted commas. And we've seen elite actors, elite mainstream actors lap it up, which is fascinating, again, saying like, oh, well, Farage is asking some important questions, or these are legitimate grievances. I mean, we saw that even after the riots, which were like incredibly racist and incredibly violent, and still there were some people who were saying that these were somewhat coming from legitimate grievances. And so we need to be, again, very, very careful with this. And this is something that we've discussed at length, and this is something that has been happening for a very long time. In the mid-1980s already, the socialist prime minister in France was saying that Jean-Marie Le Pen was asking the right questions but giving the wrong answers. And this allows far-right politics to get into the mainstream by suggesting that actually, we should listen to far-right voters, even though they are a tiny minority. And we saw what happened, in the UK in the aftermath of the 2014 EU elections when UKIP won. UKIP might have won the EU elections in 2014, but at the same time, they won the EU elections with less than 10% of the registered vote, because, EU elections have a very low turnout normally. They're also prone to protest voting and so on. And UKIP, for them, it was very easy to campaign because their main point was the EU is bad and we need to leave it. It was a lot harder for all the other parties who didn't want to leave the EU to argue about how to reform it and so on. And so in 2014, we have UKIP that wins, that leads then, that could have been nothing. They could have just won, they could have gone to Brussels and no one could have cared. But that has led instead to David Cameron promising a referendum on the EU if he were to be re-elected in 2015, which he was. The referendum took place. At the time in the UK, there was only one party that was campaigning for leaving the EU. That was UKIP, and that allowed them to then lead the agenda in that campaign, making it a very deeply far-right campaign on a really stupid question, if you ask me. And that led us to Brexit, which, of course, again, regardless of the argument about Brexit or not, it was a far-right campaign where far-right discourse was emboldened, where far-right discourse was normalized, and that has then led us to more and more mainstreaming of far-right politics over the years, as it was taken up as if it was the voice of the people. I mean, we could even question the way the Brexit referendum or the referendum on the EU was read, as the will of the people. I mean, yes, it was 50-48, but if you take into account turnout, it was actually 37% of registered voters who voted for Brexit, 34 who voted for Remain, 35 who voted for Remain, and I think 27 who abstained. And I'm not saying that Brexit didn't win; they did win, but that's not a majority of the registered voters, let alone of the people, considering how many people in this country are participating in the community and are not able to vote, including myself, for example. So, again, these discourses which really find their roots in mainstream politics and in mainstream media are incredibly important to understand the mainstreaming of far-right politics, because in a way, we are giving people like Farage a platform they don't deserve. We are exaggerating their strength, ignoring the fact that actually the vast majority of people don't vote for them. And at the same time, what we're doing is ignoring the real crisis of democracy that we are facing and that our mainstream politicians have no answer to. So, this is what we saw in the last election here in the general election a few weeks ago. We hyped the results of Reform UK, forgetting that actually, the problem is not so much Reform UK, which is a problem, no doubt, but the big problem is the fact that neither of the two main government parties are liked, are convincing, and have any answers to the many crises that we are facing. And of course, Reform has none of the answers to the crisis we are facing. And so what we're doing instead is using them as a distraction away from this crisis of democracy and really the crisis of the liberal hegemony.
Thank you, Aurelien. That historical outlook was very, very interesting and can help to contextualize a lot of what we're seeing in the UK currently. Aaron, coming back to yourself, how do you think economic issues such as unemployment, austerity have contributed to the rise of far-right sentiments?
I think it's a really good question. It does pick up on some of the things Aurelien has said. I think central to mainstreaming has been sort of euphemizing it as populism, but linked to that is also the idea that it is represented as a working class interest, or that it is that racism and the far right represents the grievances of the working class, the left behind, and racism is the central kind of ideological tenet, if you will. And I think that's dangerous in terms of both mainstreaming, but the way in which it represents the working class as white, as racist, and as potential extremists, and the way it represents inequality as something which is a problem when it can lead to extremism. And I think that's central to an understanding of the way in which both the far right, but also populism has shifted towards the right and towards and reaffirming sort of both unequal, unjust power relations between people, partly because neither the far right nor racism is ever going to solve the problem of class inequality. Controlling borders isn't going to solve that problem. And actually what it's going to also do is it's going to harm the working class who is not, it's going to hurt the working class across the board. But those who are excluded from this discussion are the sort of the racialized working class, and it's the most diverse class. I think if we take it back to two other historical moments, I mean, one is that central to the attempted mainstream appeal of the BNP in the 2000s was an attempt to represent themselves as the voice of the white working class left behind. The idea that this has become the dominant narrative in even liberal politics and political discourse in this country is quite shocking. This is a far right discourse. It also one in which I also believe is racist and classist, if that's how we assume the working class think, operate, and see their own interests. But the other historical moment is austerity. When the Conservative coalition came in 2010, in the beginning of a financial crisis where employment was an issue, people's financial situation, and the growing sort of wage and class gap. And they served up a program of austerity that targeted poor people. It targeted working class people. It targeted those who were on benefits, and they were stigmatized. They were shamed. They were called scroungers. And at that point, you start to see about 2 years later, in the build up to the hostile environment in 2012, a shift away from blaming all the poor to blaming immigrants specifically and almost only the EU too, of course. But what occurs there is a trade-off that the white working class gets class and everyone else gets race. The working class, the white working class, gets their whiteness as a class interest, and they get to blame immigrants for the financial crisis, austerity and the effects of austerity, the lack of investment and the cuts in healthcare, labor regulation, education, and sort of, wider sort of civil and community resourcing. And it becomes a significant distraction, a distraction that feeds and funds kind of like, an increased securitization of borders, but doesn't address the class interests, concerns, and crises of those who are being told immigrants are doing it. Immigrants are undercutting your wages. Immigrants are unfairly competing for your wages. No one who's calling for controls of immigration and scapegoating migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers and Muslims is calling for increased wages, is calling for a living wage, is calling for increased labor regulation, or is not calling for the expansion and of labor negotiating power and unionization. And I think that largely betrays the fact that it's not about inequality. And I think we've had this for ages now, going back to the 2000s when the BNP did this, including in John Denham in the Labour Party, arguing that if we don't address the inequality in white working class communities, we're going to have far-right extremism. And what's central to that is not seriously considering both the causes of the far right, the role of racism, or the reality of inequality and the need to address equality across the board for all people. And not just white people, and not just white working class people. And the failure to understand that constantly leads to illegitimization and mainstreaming of far-right narratives and allows the far right to represent themselves as the voice of the white working class, of the underclass, of the left behind. And we've seen this throughout these riots. We've seen labor politicians, we've seen media saying we need to address the concerns of the legitimate concerns of these people. And in fact, they're simultaneously saying these are thugs, these are terrorists, these are extremists. These have nothing to do with British society, and they're expressing legitimate concerns that we have to represent. And being that they've been trying to represent them for like a decade now, at least, I'm not sure where we go with that contradiction, but that is the function of the far right. It is to be the outlier, the exception, the extremist, and an excuse.
Thank you, Aaron. Wanted to come back to yourself, Aurelien, and this has been touched on many times in this call, and it's also been a feature of a lot of discourse this past couple of weeks. How has the UK media, so the mainstream media, reported the riots, and do you think this coverage has been balanced?
No, no, it hasn't, and it's been appalling as expected, really. And Aaron and I, with Katie Brown in particular, have done a lot of work on the media and the mainstream media's response to the far right and coverage of the far right. And we could have done a kind of like bingo card, and all of them would have been ticked, to be honest. So some of the things that we've seen. First, in particular, was not naming what was happening, pretending that they were just riots, that they were just, to quote, like using like the language of some of the politicians as well, pure violence. They were just protesters. They were, I think it was on the BBC that we had a pro-Britain protester that was even said, a pro-Britain protest, which is euphemizing, of course. It took a very long time for the word racism to be mentioned, for the word Islamophobia to be mentioned. We saw also on some of the media, where Ed Balls, for example, was incredibly rude to Zara Sultana about naming Islamophobia, and this is just exactly what we have come to expect from the mainstream media, including the media in particular, that pretends that they are opposed to far right politics, and yet seems to be going far more strongly against the people opposing far-right politics than they are against the far right. So what we've seen also is the platforming of far-right actors, even those who have crossed many, many lines in the last few days, including certain academics who are being platformed and hyped by the mainstream media and the left-wing media as well, as we've seen in the last couple of days. So again, a lot of bad practice here in platforming these actors. We've seen a lot of platforming of rioters as well, giving them space to say that they're not far right, but they have legitimate grievances, that they are not bad people and so on, as opposed to actually platforming the people who are the sharp end of politics, of this politics, the people who are suffering from these attacks, or the people who have expertise in analyzing these politics as well. So what we see instead is some kind of euphemization through their own words, but also almost legitimization through the idea that they might have some legitimate grievances or a past that could excuse their actions somehow. We've also seen false equivalencies in recent days, particularly since the counter-protests have grown, that have kind of portrayed the protests and the counter-protests as equivalent almost, as if they were just two protests. And this has been really bad. We've seen, of course, equivalencies being drawn between fascists, bringing violence onto the streets, and communities defending themselves as well. Again, absolutely terrible. We've seen hyping. I was on an interview in a French TV channel a few days ago, where the lead-up was the idea that the UK was a completely divided country. And it's like, well, there are clear divisions in the UK at the moment, but the vast majority of people are against the fascists as well. So, there's a tiny minority of fascist extremists on the streets at the moment. They are being enabled by a significant minority of the population, and in particular by people in elite positions. But at the same time, I still do believe strongly that most people are against them. They might not take action though, and that's where the problem lies. So I think, again, there's a problem of hyping and exaggerating the strength of these movements, no matter how much damage they do, of course, even if it's only a few of them on the streets. And finally, I think the worst thing is that there's been zero reflection on the role of the mainstream media and mainstream elite actors in the mainstreaming of far-right politics. There's been no reflection in thinking about who sets the agenda, who promotes certain ideas, who puts them on front pages, who decides what goes at the top of the Guardian, of the Times, of tabloids even, and there's been some incredibly bad practice. I mean, we saw, for example, the Sun and the Daily Mail pretending that they were on the side of counter-protesters yesterday, which is absolutely appalling, considering that they spent decades mainstreaming Islamophobia, racism, and the far right. And so that worries me a lot, to see zero reflection. I mean, I don't expect any from the Daily Mail or the Sun, obviously, but to see zero reflection from the Guardian, to see zero reflection from even the left-wing media in this country, this is what really, really worries me. And instead, what we've seen is a shifting of the blame either on extreme right thugs in inverted commas, or on social media, as we're going to talk about soon, or on even like Russia and foreign actors. So there's this kind of like the people who are in control, who have a privileged access to shaping our public discourse, are just washing their hands, pretending that they have no responsibility and no power when it comes to setting the agenda, even though they are the editors. They are the people who decide what's going to be talked about, what's going to be promoted, how it's going to be talked about, whether we're going to talk about racism or populism, and so on and so forth. And this, to me, is an absolute failure in the responsibility that the media should have in upholding democratic values and in keeping communities safe. And it makes me incredibly angry, as I'm sure you can hear.
Yes, Aurelien. I mean, a couple of months ago, we did a podcast episode with the Centre for Media Monitoring, looking at the British media's reporting of the war in Gaza, and that's been equally appalling.
Absolutely. This is what's absolutely fascinating to me, is like, we could see in even in the Daily Mail and the Sun, the counter-protesters being praised, but these were the same people who were being like, called hate marches, a few weeks ago as well. I mean, this is absolutely appalling, and all of this has been fueling this extreme right violence.
No, exactly. Aaron and Aurelien touched on social media. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about what you think the role of social media has been in the ongoing violence.
Yes, I appreciate the question about social media following a question about political legitimizers and mainstream media, partly because throughout this, the first question, and seems to be the first thesis, is this is all coming from fringe actors on social media. And that, to me, is quite similar to the idea that these are fringe extremists, or it's acts of pure violence. It has nothing to do with the mainstream, the body politic, or the political culture. It's a displacement exercise. There's no doubt that social media plays a role. And social media has played a role in fueling conspiracy theories. It has been used for networking and organizing across the far right. And we are in a period where we're what Hope Not Hate refers to as the post-organizational far right, in the sense that you can mobilize online and you can mobilize disparate actors, and it no longer has to be formal strategies. And this allows for influencers. This and central to this is, and I think this is really important to the moment we're in, because there's a number of factors leading to this moment. One is the mainstreaming and emboldening of the far right over a longer period of time, as we've touched on. The other thing is an election, which is seen as an opportunity to falsely represent the Labour Party or Labour government as woke or left, and not focused on immigration, to sort of bolster Reform UK or Reform UK. But also the fact that Tommy Robinson and other influencers have been returned to social media, and particularly to X, after having been banned from Twitter when Elon Musk took over. And this has played a significant role. But the focus on social media seems to be an accepted narrative in the same way the Left Behind is. And these get reaffirmed again and again and again, such that they become truisms that require, analyses and arguments about racism and wider working class and class inequalities, or arguments about the mainstream media and mainstream politics playing a significant role, have to be made in the strongest possible terms as interventions, not as go-to arguments that are part of an important analysis of where we are and how we got here. Yes, what's going on X is going on in TikTok, Telegram, operating through creating different networks, different opportunities, and addressing different but overlapping constituencies. But we're also seeing, for a long period of time, the media mainstreaming scapegoating and hate for migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, Muslims, Black Lives Matter, Antifa, anti-racist, and so-called wokeness, in a way that has represented a sort of reactionary far right culture war narrative as if it's really taking place. The far right have been emboldened by this, and we see the focus on social media and on fringe actors, but we see the mainstream media and political establishment not taking responsibility for the way they represent migration as a threat, or anti-immigrant racism and xenophobia as a legitimate expression or a legitimate concern. And they don't take responsibility for the way they may accept the terms of far-right politics, that you have to the sort of the hatred, the racism, the scapegoating. And then they turn around and instead of reflecting, as Aurelien has said, on their own roles in this legitimization, mainstreaming, and emboldening of the far right, they turn to social media platforms and say, regulate yourself. And what they're doing is they're asking another sort of corporate platform to sacrifice profits and deal with what is effectively a normalized part of the political culture that they themselves are amplifying and legitimizing. And, the social media platforms have proven again and again and again that they'll ban individuals. They may ban certain terms, but they're not able to, just like, they're not willing or able to address things which are and discourses and narratives that are completely acceptable in our political culture and our mediascape. It's not just one location that is unregulated an unregulated Wild West that is tainting everything else. It is not just one movement that is doing this. We have to see this systemically.
Thank you, Aaron. So I wanted to wrap up and ask you both a question. Looking ahead, what can we as academics, as civil society organizations, and the general public do to effectively counter the influence of the far right in the hope of preventing future unrest and violence? So I'll come to you first, Aurelien, and then to yourself, Aaron.
Yeah, I mean that's a big question, but I think we know many of the answers, and obviously it depends on what your role is in all of this, right? Politicians can do different things to the media, can do different things to policy organizations and so on, and academics as well have a role to play. I think in general terms, I think what we need to do is to take responsibility for the role we play in setting the agenda at our different levels, right? I think what we've seen is far too often people pretending that they don't have any power. We've seen editors of massive newspapers do that. For example, in 2018, I think when The Guardian launched its series on the so-called new populism, their first article was, why is populism suddenly all the rage? Why are we talking about populism in The Guardian so much? And it's like, at no point in the 6 months that followed, despite massive amount of investment, did they ever think that maybe they had a role to play into what goes into their own newspaper. And we see that all the time, there's no accountability. We see left-wing media platforming far-right actors and then pretending that they won the discussion of a debate. It's like, why platform them? These people are not coming onto your platforms to win the debate. They are coming on these platforms to get legitimacy by simply being there and to get their point heard. Why not instead talking to people who actually are at the sharp end of this politics, or to talk to people who actually study this politics? So we need to take responsibility. We need to stop enabling the far right, whether through platforming it or through platforming its ideas, or euphemizing it, or giving them credence by saying, as Aaron was talking about before, that these come from popular grievances, that they come from the working class or anything like this. And finally, we need to take an uncompromising stance against the far right. We can't make excuses for them. They are a direct threat to many communities, and as such, they are a direct threat to democracy. And if we're serious about protecting all these communities and democracy, I don't think we can take a stance that allows them in. I think we need to take a much more uncompromising stance and stop falling for their narratives of free speech and so on. I think these are narratives that have been massively debunked for a very long time, and I think it is a clear failure from the mainstream elite to really act. And I think at this stage it is complicity, to be honest.
Agreed. Thank you, Aurelien. Aaron, coming to yourself.
Returning to the issue of social media, we hear a lot about misinformation and disinformation on social media leading to all this. But what we don't hear is a reflection on or an acceptance of challenges to the myths, lies, and narratives that have led us to where we are. This includes the idea that these are legitimate grievances of the left behind or the working class, or that the only way to fight the far right is through counterterrorism or democratization and representation of their ideas. I think central to how we move forward is we connect the far right to the mainstream, and both to systemic racism and inequality, and that's inequality for all. I think we have to connect inequality not to extremism, but to capitalism and to the way in which we've been governed. And I think we need to ensure there is a vibrant, healthy, left-wing, anti-racist, and anti-fascist voice to challenge these ideas in the mainstream. I'm afraid the shifting of the political spectrum from the center to the far right, demonizing the left and anti-racists, excluding racialized people as working class or as worthy of representation, and the overrepresentation of far right ideas, which reaffirm and support the maintenance of the status quo, both economically, socially, culturally, cannot go on. That needs to be challenged. And we need a real, serious, progressive, anti-racist politics.
Thank you, Aaron. And I'm hoping that's a constructive way with which to end this discussion. Obviously, the last couple of weeks have been quite difficult seeing what's happening on our streets, but hopefully there is some room for encouragement there moving forward. Thank you so much to both of you for joining and for your amazing work in this area and encountering the predominant narrative around the far right. Make sure you follow Aurelien and Aaron on Twitter. They post regular updates and thoughts on what is going on, which are extremely insightful, and do follow the work of Community Policy Forum across all social media platforms. Thank you.